Coming to you entirely pre-recorded from the Garage of Solitude here in Whitestone, Queens, I am Mario-Francisco Robles, and this is episode 4 of the Superman on Film podcast. This is a very special episode of the show because not only is it episode 4, not only are we now 49 weeks away from the arrival of James Gunn's Superman, but this is the first week I get to wear my brand new James Gunn Superman shirt. That's right. It arrived. I was waiting for it for a while. I thought it might not make it in time for this episode, but my brand new Superman shirt has arrived, featuring the very same insignia that David Corenswet will be wearing in next year's Superman. And listen, I got the one that doesn't have that little glow in the center that I was telling you about last week. Remember? The San Diego Comic-Con version of the shirt has this interesting choice that they made where there is a solar glow, a solar flare that seems to come from within the center of the emblem. And I've always just said, just give me the symbol. I just want to wear the Superman emblem on my chest. I don't need some kind of artsy glow on it. Just give me the S. And thankfully, Hot Topic responded with an official DC licensed Superman shirt from the new movie without the glow in the middle. So yes, for those of you who want to check it out at the Hot Topic website, order it today. From what I hear, it is selling out all over the place. Superman is very popular right now. And this week, there's one of my very favorite pieces of news that I've been wanting to report for a while. I've been waiting for this day for a while. But yes, after what feels like years of previewing what might be the next Superman movie, we are now at a point in time where I can offer you a Superman on film update that goes a little something like this. Ladies and gentlemen, this week, Superman wrapped filming. That's right. James Gunn's Superman is no longer just a thing that's going to get worked on. It's no longer just a thing that we have to hope gets off the ground. It's not one of many potential reboot possibilities for Superman. It is a movie that is now in post-production. It is one massive step closer to becoming a reality. So here we are, 49 weeks away from the arrival of James Gunn's Superman, and they have wrapped. And James Gunn himself took to Instagram a couple days ago to post a special note on Wrap Day using a picture from early on in production in Norway when they were filming some scenes for the Fortress of Solitude. With that picture, he posted this note regarding the wrap. He says, "And that's a wrap. God bless our cast and crew whose commitment, creativity, and hard work have brought this project to life. I set out to make a movie about a good man in a world that isn't always so much. And the goodness and kindness and love I've encountered on a daily basis on the set has inspired me and thrust me forward when I felt too spent to move on my own. Thank you all from the bottom of my heart. It has been an honor. The destination has been Superman, but the journey has been the toil and the laughter and the emotions and ideas and magic we've shared together on set. And for that, I am forever grateful." So there you go. James Gunn's Superman is now in post-production. It's a real thing that's on the way, and we get to cover it every week. As every little bit of news and interesting possibilities spring up from little teases that come along the way, we're going to be here every week just to break it all down. But for now, since we are talking about the future and we're excited for the future, I feel a very pressing need to also talk about the past, because this week's episode has to do with how the last Superman's run ended. It has to do with our boy Henry Cavill and how Dwayne Johnson betrayed him and betrayed all of DC, trying to turn DC into his own little personal vanity project that he could put himself at the center of, and how that ultimately teased fans around the world, disrupted the narrative of what was going to be happening with DC on screen, and has created a controversial mess that exists to this day within fans of the Superman film community. Because there's many people to this day who think James Gunn fired Henry Cavill. And they think that after Black Adam, there was all this stuff set in stone that James Gunn just ran in and said, no, not anymore. I'm the Grinch that stole Henry. There's no Henry Cavill for you. So today, we're going to talk a little bit about what actually went down. You're going to get the history lesson of how we got to that moment in October of 2022 where it looked like, whoa, Henry Cavill is back. And then within weeks, we knew otherwise. That's what this episode is all about. So let's get to it, shall we? In order to do any of this, we got to go all the way back to the beginning. Because you see, if you hear Dwayne Johnson talk about it, especially around the time that Black Adam was coming out and he was trying to get the world hyped for it, he would have you believe that this was some deep-rooted passion project that he had been trying to get off the ground for many, many years. And while that is true, while he was involved with DC for many, many years, with early reports linking him to Black Adam way far back as 2007, it should be made clear that this wasn't because Dwayne Johnson was some big Black Adam fan who approached DC about his passion for the character and how badly he wanted to play Black Adam. No. He even admitted early on that what he had an interest in was simply working with DC, working with superheroes in general, and trying to get an extension of his brand into the superhero world. Because you see, The Rock was a very successful professional wrestler there for a few years, but he pretty quickly went Hollywood. And somewhere around 2002, he made the jump from being full-time wrestler to trying to be a full-time actor in Hollywood after a starring role in The Mummy Returns and in the Scorpion King spin-off that came afterward. He quickly saw Hollywood as the next place for his considerable talents and charisma to land. So at that same time, superheroes were becoming very, very hot. The Sam Raimi, Tobey Maguire Spider-Man trilogy was the biggest thing in the world. The Batman Begins Dark Knight trilogy that was coming from Christopher Nolan was one of the hottest things going in the world. And everyone was trying to get in on the superhero business, including in 2007, Marvel Studios itself was already beginning to put together its master plan for world pop culture domination. So naturally, Dwayne Johnson was like, I want to get in on that. I want to be a superhero too. And the way he approached it was basically to say that he wanted the fans to dictate who he should be. And fans saw him as someone who was kind of a cool, cocky, arrogant, sarcastic, badass type of character. So they pitched characters to him like Black Adam and like Lobo. And according to him, fans were very much pushing the Black Adam idea. So he went ahead and said, why don't we make a Black Adam movie during his initial discussions with DC? But those discussions would come and go over the years, and they would evolve. And pretty quickly after that 2007 conversation about him being Black Adam, we started hearing maybe he's going to be Lobo. They'd even gotten a director on board, and they started to develop a Lobo movie. But then that fell apart somewhere around 2012 or 2013. And all of a sudden, instead of talking about Lobo, he started talking about Green Lantern. That's right. He went from Black Adam to Lobo to all of a sudden around 2013 and 2014, he started dropping hints about things he wanted to do as John Stewart's Green Lantern. That's right. The African-American Green Lantern from the comics. And for those of you who've been paying attention to DC on film for a long time, you'll know that in Zack Snyder's Justice League, he had a role written. He had a part included there for Green Lantern because Zack Snyder wanted to build out an entire, very expansive DC universe that included nearly all of DC's AAA characters. And at around the time that he was formulating that plan, coincidentally in 2014, that's when Dwayne Johnson started dropping all kinds of interesting hints about how Jon Stewart can still whoop Superman's butt and all kinds of things, which is, again, it was a strange way to take it because Jon Stewart is a good guy. He's a hero. And Superman is a good guy. He's a hero. But as far back as 2014, Dwayne Johnson was already trying to gear up for some kind of a fight between his DC character and Superman. He had like some kind of an idea for that for a long time. But then, clearly, whatever went on with Zack Snyder and his vision for Green Lantern, that went on the fritz. And we wouldn't see any of that until we got an alternate cut of Zack Snyder's Justice League 7 years later. But what we did see is that The Rock quickly backed out of that. He was not going to be a part of the Snyderverse. He never actually linked himself to any of the stuff that was coming from Zack Snyder. In fact, in interviews around that time, he was always surprisingly non-committal about when we were going to see him and if he was in any way connected to the plans that Zack Snyder was cooking up post Man of Steel. He was always very just kind of vague. It was always, yeah, we'll see. I don't know if we're going to be involved with what they're working on over there, but that's the exciting part. Just stay tuned. You'll see what happens. And he was all too happy to sit on the sidelines while DC was trying to figure out what its next big steps would be. And then what happened? The year 2016 arrived, and in March of 2016, a theatrical cut of Batman vs. Superman came out that was received so poorly that it got a 26% on Rotten Tomatoes, and by weekend 2, it suffered a historic drop, and right away, Warner Brothers went into panic mode. Granted, they had already been panicking for a few months, and they had already chopped up Batman vs. Superman into a half-hour short movie with a lot less Superman in it, in a cut that made a lot of people go, what is this? And only the hardest of the hardcores really, really loved Batman vs. Superman, while the rest of us would enjoy a little more the ultimate cut that came a little bit later. Overall, Batman vs. Superman created a PR issue for Warner Brothers and DC, who were hoping that the film was going to catapult them to Avengers-level success. They thought if we have a movie that has Batman and Superman, and it mentions Dawn of Justice in the title, everyone's going to get excited because they're going to realize this is a Justice League lead-up movie, and you're going to see your two favorite heroes ever duke it out toe-to-toe before teaming up. You know, they really thought this was going to be their answer to the Avengers. This was going to be the big one. And they spent hundreds of millions of dollars trying to get it there, and then quickly changed their minds before it even made it to theaters. When it was still just in the test screening phase, the studio already got cold feet on everything that they had approved for Snyder to do. They chopped up Batman vs. Superman. We got a movie at the end of March that created havoc for DC on film, and the overhaul became a very, very public thing. Because all of a sudden, David Ayer's Suicide Squad was also getting reshot, and they were adding new sequences and changing the ending and altering the tone of the movie. And in the summer of 2016, Warner Brothers announced that DC had new bosses, that there was a whole new sheriff in town, that the people who had approved Man of Steel and Batman vs. Superman and the stuff that we had already heard about were no longer in charge, but rather DC Entertainment was being now spearheaded by Jeff Johns and John Berg and Ann Sarnoff, and it was going to be a whole new ball game, and they were now going to move full steam into an era of hope and fun and joy and optimism. Because they knew that people had not really taken to Zack Snyder's more mature take. They knew they needed now to go into something more bright and optimistic. And that was finally when Dwayne Johnson allowed himself to become front and center for a little while. There's a famous picture of him standing in front of the big blue and white DC logo, where he's talking about this wonderful meeting he just had with DC Entertainment and about how bright the future is and all this stuff. You know, the quotes from that, he said, "I had a very cool and strategic meeting with the heads of DC about their entire universe. As a hardcore DC fan, to get a real sense of the tonal shifts and developments coming in these future movies has me fired up. Something we as DC fans have all been waiting for a very long time. Hope, optimism, and fun," in capital letters. Fun. Even when talking about the most ruthless villain anti-hero of all time finally coming to life. Prepare yourselves, DC Universe. Hashtag kneel at his feet, Black Adam. So it wasn't finally until the summer of 2016 when he knew that the Zack Snyderverse was getting shifted out of rotation that he decided, okay, now I want to be shifted into rotation. But the interesting thing was that even with this pivot that DC and Warner Brothers were taking in 2016, they weren't exactly taking like a hard reset approach at their DC plans. They didn't delay anything that was currently in production. You know, they still proceeded. They released Suicide Squad on schedule when it was supposed to come out, despite some very hasty reshoots and 6 different versions reportedly being re-edited to try to make the most marketable version of the movie. Okay? That happened in, the summer of 2016. Then the following year, we got that Justice League movie. And yet that Justice League movie had been completely, like more than half of it had been reshot and rewritten. And yet it still arrived on time in November of 2017. So if you were someone working over at DC, you knew it's going to take a little while for this pivot, for this reboot to take form, because we still have movies that are on the way that are from this line of stories. And the studio is trying hastily to course correct on the fly. Instead of hitting pause and going, you know what, we're going to save Justice League for another year or two. We need to figure out what to do after Suicide Squad happens. No, the studio had already run full steam into production on other things, even as the public was saying, we don't really like what you're working on. Okay, it was a crazy situation. So Dwayne Johnson, once again, sat on the sidelines. Once again, there was no real talk or real movement of a Black Adam movie for several years. And Warner Brothers got new bosses. At some point, Toby Emmerich was calling the shots, and then he brought in Walter Hamada. And then under the Hamada administration, there had been focuses on all these other different kinds of DC characters, while it seemed like he was trying to come up with a way to bring the AAA characters back, but maybe with a brand new fresh coat of paint after a soft reboot with the Flashpoint movie that was going to be coming out. There was all this kind of influx stuff going. DC was in sort of a limbo. Feeling some success, right? It had Aquaman, which made $1 billion and showed people that these characters can still thrive under different creative leadership, even if they were from the Snyderverse. James Wan had great success with Aquaman. But after that, things became much more uneasy. No other film really touched any massive box office success aside from the standalone spin-off of Joker, which had nothing to do with their other DC plans. Other projects like Birds of Prey and Shazam, they did okay, but they didn't exactly light the world on fire, and they didn't bring the DC brand on strong in some exciting new way. Like, okay, you didn't like Batman versus Superman, but here's our bold new direction. There wasn't anything particularly bold about it. So Dwayne sat on the sidelines waiting for his moment. And what's interesting, too, is this Shazam movie that came out in 2018, or was it 2019? See, I'm doing this off the top of my head. Regardless of when Shazam came out, what you need to know is that Dwayne was supposed to be part of that. The original version of the Shazam movie found Shazam fighting Black Adam. And why would that be? Could it be because Black Adam is Shazam's primary villain? Yeah, probably. So yes, in that movie, it was supposed to be Shazam versus Black Adam, but Johnson, already feeling like he wanted to be a bigger deal than just a villain in a Shazam movie, he made the shrewd decision that we should split them up. We should do a Shazam movie and we should do a Black Adam movie. And mind you, now he wasn't just a star, he was now going to be a producer, because he was bringing in his Seven Bucks production company to work alongside New Line Cinema, which was a subsidiary of Warner Brothers, but not Warner Brothers proper. He was getting his $7 production company in bed with New Line so that he could be a producer on these Black Adam movies. That's right. He wanted that Robert Downey Jr. money. He wanted to not just get paid to be the star of the movie. He wanted to get paid to be the producer and the mastermind behind it as well. So you get your paycheck up front and you get your points on the back end. So as the box office totals run up, your percentage continues to hit and you get check after check after check for the success that movie's having. So he saw big dollar signs in being more than just a villain in the Shazam movie. So he broke his Black Adam apart from the Shazam film. And that's another thing that should be noted too, circling back to his unique deal with DC, where they didn't necessarily have him tied down to one particular character. When Shazam was being shopped around and when Shazam was being put together, Dwayne had the option to be Shazam or Black Adam. Have you ever heard of an actor being given that kind of leeway? You know, of course, it happens with the top end guys. I'm sure Tom Cruise gets to pick who he wants to be. He doesn't have to audition, right? But when you think of all the other castings that we hear about in these kinds of movies, you never hear like, hey, Robert Downey Jr., who do you feel like playing? Like, no, he was cast as Iron Man. They wanted him as Tony Stark. You know, but Black Adam, Dwayne Johnson, chose who he wants to be by himself. It was part of a shrewd career move, not the studio casting him because they thought this guy would be an amazing Black Adam. You get the difference? So he chose to be Black Adam. He chose to move Black Adam out of Shazam. He chose to not really include Black Adam in any major way or tease within the Shazam movie. Even though they are each other's main foes, he didn't want anything really to do with Shazam. And Shazam ended up not being that well, it didn't go over that well. It was a well-liked movie. I loved it. And a lot of people still go back to thinking that was a beautiful, tender pivot point in DC on film. But overall, it didn't exactly set the world on fire. And who knows what might have happened if the megawatt international superstar known as The Rock would have shown up in it, teasing a future confrontation with Shazam. You know, that would have been an awesome thing, wouldn't it? But it didn't happen. And instead, he went full on into quietly producing and preparing and focus testing and focus grouping his Black Adam movie that he hoped was going to change the what did he call it? The hierarchy of power in DC will change forever. That's what he was hoping would happen with Black Adam. And it took a couple years, but as that Black Adam plan came along, he started teasing confrontations with Shazam. No. He started teasing confrontations with Superman. Yes, Black Adam. Now, mind you, there is a precedence for this. Black Adam and Superman and Shazam have all tussled in the comics and in animated projects. So there is a history there. And it could be an interesting fight. Black Adam, whose powers come from magic, and he's basically like an evil Superman, versus Superman, who has a weakness to magic and is a good Superman. It sounds funny putting it that way. But, you know, it would have been an interesting dynamic to have these two go toe-to-toe. But it's definitely not the first thing you think about when you think about Black Adam or Superman. And yet, on Instagram, he would drop little teases. On Twitter, he would drop little teases. And of course, fans would get excited. Even I would get excited. I started pointing out in like 2019, 2020 that really it seems that Dwayne Johnson might be our way to get Superman back on the big screen. Because since he was talking so much about Superman, and he had a very unique connection to Henry Cavill's Superman, I started alerting people on the Fanboy podcast. I started writing about it on revengeofthefans.com that it seems like Dwayne Johnson's team might be the people who bring Henry Cavill back. And little did I know at the time how accurate that would be. But either way, while he's making this Black Adam movie, he already has in mind that they want to tease a Superman confrontation. And he initially asked Walter Hamada, who was in charge of Superman and in charge of all of DC, for permission to have that cameo. But Hamada vetoed it. Hamada said, no, I have no plans for Henry Cavill's Superman. We're waiting for The Flash to come out, and then we're rebooting. He wanted to basically start fresh on a lot of these characters and use the Flash movie to basically reset things. Keep what worked from the DCEU and put us on a trajectory for a new future with revamped, reworked versions of all these characters, a la what James Wan had done with Aquaman. Just put a fresh coat of paint on him. That's what he was hoping to do. So he told The Rock, no, you can't have Henry Cavill. We're done with Henry Cavill. But you can film a Superman cameo that's like the one from Shazam, a vague one where you don't see his face, where it's just a general Superman appearance, and then we could take it from there. That is what Walter Hamada had approved, and Black Adam entered production with that as the plan. And on the last day of reshoots was when they finally shot that scene. They shot that scene with The Rock and a body double because there was no Henry Cavill yet, and there was no set decision on which Superman this is going to be. Just that this is going to be Superman in general showing up to have a word with Black Adam. And he shot that, and they even started testing that cut of the movie to focus groups and test audiences to see what they thought. And according to them, the response was very favorable, very positive. People very much liked the idea that Black Adam may have a fight with Superman in his next movie. But there was some confusion about, him not having a head. And there was this feeling that like this scene loses its real punch, its real heft, if we have no idea who he's talking to aside from the red cape and the S on his chest. We really need to have a specific Superman on here. And at this point in time, at the end of the summer of 2022, when they were doing these additional shoots, the movie was coming out in October. Okay? The movie was coming out in just a couple of months. And at the end of August and in early September is when The Rock made a huge push to the people running Warner Brothers at the time. That was Michael DeLuca and Pamela Abdy. And he said, listen, we've got this great idea for Black Adam and Superman. We're testing it out. People are all excited about it. But listen, it's got to be Henry. We got to use Henry Cavill, and we got to set up a Black Adam versus Superman. We got to get a Man of Steel 2 off the ground. We got to push, we got to make this happen because there's all this interest in it. And he was pushing this because, well, his ex-wife, Dani Garcia, was his manager. And who was she also managing for years? She was managing Henry Cavill. And she'd been trying to get Henry Cavill some more Superman work for years. But after the theatrical cut of Justice League tanked in 2017, she couldn't get it done. She kept pushing. She had lots of shrewd business meetings with Warner Brothers Pictures, just couldn't get him back in the red cape. It just wasn't working. But what was unique now was that things were a little bit different. It was 2022, and Walter Hamada was no longer in charge. Walter Hamada was now just a lame duck president for DC Entertainment because Warner Brothers had been bought out by Discovery. And now they were Warner Brothers Discovery with a new boss. And this new boss was David Zaslav. And in the spring of 2022, a few months before all this went down, right away, he came in and started pointing out that why is DC doing so poorly? Why do we have these amazing characters like Superman and Wonder Woman languishing? Why don't we have like a steady line of movies and products coming out from this DC IP? This thing is a mess. And right out of the gate, there were industry reports that Zaslav wanted to shake things up. He couldn't understand how the previous owners had let DC get this way. So right away, as new owner of everything, he decided we need to do what Marvel's doing. We need one central architect who's going to oversee everything. I need my Kevin Feige. I need my guy who's going to answer all the questions, who's going to come up with the grand plan, who understands what the fans like, who understands the appeal of these characters, and is going to build me a universe that's going to finally be operating at full capacity, finally doing what DC can do, which Warner Brothers had been faltering on for years. Warner Brothers hadn't had an amazingly successful winning run with DC since Christopher Nolan's Dark Knight trilogy, which wrapped all the way in 2012. So right off the bat, in the spring of 2022, we knew David Zaslav is in the market right now. He's currently interviewing people to be the head of DC. He wants his Kevin Feige. So now, with Dwayne Johnson feeling the heat, he's feeling the pressure. There's no real DC boss. There's going to be a new DC boss, but you've got a movie that was created in this limbo period, and you don't know if this new DC boss is going to want to continue with what you've been working on very hard for these last couple of years. So now it's time for you, before the final decision has been made, to go to the people at Warner Brothers and make your power play. Because all reports claim, too, that he met with David Zaslav. He tried to get everything approved. He wanted power. He wanted $7 Entertainment to essentially become the DC czar. He wanted his brother-in-law, or former brother-in-law, Hiram Garcia, to essentially be that Kevin Feige role. And he made a hard push for that to be the case. But David Zaslav wasn't just talking to The Rock. He was already speaking with James Gunn, who he had a very high opinion of, whom had already been working for DC prior to Zaslav, because he had done the Suicide Squad. And he was already working on that Peacemaker series for Max. So David was already talking to James Gunn, and by all reports had already asked him, can you be my guy? James Gunn at the time said no, he didn't want to be in charge of an entire studio. And later on, he said what finally made him willing to take it was that as long as he had an actual producer as a partner who could take care of the business end of things so that he can just work on the creative end of things, then he would do it. But at the time, he was just like a solo advisor to David Zaslav. He was even making suggestions for who he thinks could be that Kevin Feige type. Even as Zaslav was going, yeah, but I'd still rather it was you. But he was just working as an advisor. And he even took the job of writing a Superman reboot that the studio asked him to do in the spring of 2022. Okay? I'm telling you all this because now let's go back to the summer of 2022. Okay? So David Zaslav is already talking to James Gunn, and he's already taking interviews about a new head of DC, his own Kevin Feige type. And there's already rumors of who that could be. A few names had already started to get floated around, and it really seemed like, wow, DC is about to get a bold new direction very soon. But with his movie in limbo, and with this faceless, headless cameo, creating curiosity and excitement, Dwayne made the big decision we're going to push for Henry, Because if we have Henry Cavill, the very recognized face of Superman, show up in this, and at the same time, we announce that he's not only back for this, but we're also taking meetings for a Man of Steel 2. And that we're finally going to get to see this Superman do some of the stuff that fans have been begging for years. How could the new boss cancel that? You know, he thought he was going to put whoever this new boss is, I'm going to put them in a thankless, unwinnable position. I'm going to force their hand, because no matter who David Zaslav hires, if my Black Adam movie is a hit and the entire online pop culture world is talking about Henry Cavill's return and Black Adam versus Superman, there's no way that this new boss can stop that. So he went and he pushed, and at the last second, I believe the date they gave was September 5th, was when Henry Cavill finally shot his cameos. This was, 7 weeks before the movie came out. So there was going to be no Henry Cavill appearance in Black Adam until about 7 weeks before the movie came out. This was an 11th hour last minute decision, because Johnson didn't get what he wanted from Zaslav, but he knew that Pamela Abdi and Michael DeLuca were running things at Warner Brothers, and that if he could get them to agree, that he's golden. And he got them to agree, even though they were just the temporary babysitters of DC, even though they also knew that they were about to be replaced as decision makers on DC. They approved of this plan. So on September 5th, Henry Cavill shot the first of his couple of cameos that he would shoot for both Black Adam and for The Flash. But here's what should be noted about that, okay? He did not sign a new deal. Okay, there was no new contract for you are going to be Henry Cavill for 3 more movies or even 1 more movie, and there's an option for a second. No. He was brought back on a per appearance deal. He was paid a very handsome fee per cameo, but that was it. It was just an appearance deal. It was not a film deal. You understand the difference? So he came, he collected his fee for shooting the cameos in Black Adam and The Flash. I think he even also had something for Shazam. I think he might have shot as many as 4, because when Abdi and DeLuca approved of this plan, they really thought, okay, if this is what we're going to do, then this is what we're going to do. We're going to bring back Henry Cavill. We're going to try to introduce an all-new Justice League that includes Henry Cavill's Superman, but Michael Keaton's Batman. And we're going to do all this weird, funky stuff to try to bring DC back. And we'll show David Zaslav that we've got the hot hand. We've got the big, exciting plan that Zaslav should be over the moon about. And then what happened? What happened? Black Adam bombed. Black Adam only opened to $67 million, and the reviews were pretty bad, and the buzz coming out of it was pretty much non-existent. Everyone was talking about how the movie itself was, it was an enjoyable bit of superhero popcorn action fluff. I talked about it on the Fanboy podcast. I thought it was great, for what it was. It was a pure bubblegum, fizzy, empty, hollow roller coaster ride of a movie that you could tell was like focus grouped to death. You could tell that they took all these different elements from other successful superhero movies, threw them in a blender, and threw in some fun one-liners and an awesome suit, and they thought, all right, we've got our Black Adam movie, and it ended up not connecting. It didn't work. So that came out on October 21st, and within days of that film coming out, Warner Brothers Discovery announces that they have hired James Gunn and Peter Safran to form DC Studios and essentially become the bosses for all of DC on film. Just to put it into perspective, the whole thing is mental, okay? Black Adam comes out October 21st. October 24th, Henry Cavill goes on Instagram and says he's back. He says he's back as Superman. But then the very next day, October 25th, is when the James Gunn, Peter Safran, DC Studios announcement is made. So in just a span of days, we're getting some very interesting, very mixed signals. And the wackiness didn't end there, because in the months to come, James Gunn and Henry Cavill had to meet and make a public statement about the fact that despite the fact that you were told this, despite the fact that Henry announced it on Instagram and went on a podcast a week later talking about his plans for what he was going to do with Superman, despite the Hollywood Reporter and Variety picking up on reports that Henry was taking meetings for a Man of Steel 2 with Charles Roven and a writer and Warner Brothers, and they were really trying to make this happen. Despite all of that, James Gunn and Henry Cavill had to announce in December that no, in fact, Henry Cavill will not be returning as Superman, and he is not going to be the Superman in the James Gunn reboot that Gunn had been asked to write months before Cavill was even a thing in Black Adam. So, as if that weren't the strangest part of it, weeks later, thanks to some reporting from my old Latino review friend Humberto El Mayimbe Gonzalez over at The Wrap, we got some other details about exactly the extent of The Rock's power play. Because, see, The Rock, he did not see himself as a Shazam villain at all. He wanted to make himself the center of a Justice Society movie. He wanted to try to get to a place where the whole Justice League is coming after him. And he gets to be both the villain and then ultimately the really cool, badass anti-hero at the center of everything. And his basic plans for these next few years were to build an entire DC universe that is essentially just around himself. That's right, around himself. And don't just take my word for it, okay? Zachary Levi himself said this, okay? After that article came out over on the Instagram, someone had, summed it all up by saying, The Wrap confirms that in Shazam, Fury of the Gods, the Justice Society from Black Adam were recruiting Shazam in the post-credits. The Rock denied access, and David F. Sandberg had to make a last-minute decision to add Emilia and John. Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson attempted to restructure the DCEU centering on him and Henry Cavill's Superman, and The Rock didn't allow Zachary Levi to cameo in a post-credit scene for Black Adam. Okay, those were the bullet points. And what did Zachary Levi do? He shared that and said, the truth shall set you free. Okay, Shazam himself confirmed all of this, that The Rock canceled the Justice Society being a part of the Shazam movie. And if you ask, how can that be? It's because he, as a producer, he being the one that introduced the Justice Society in his New Line $7 Productions co-venture, he gets to decide who these characters, he gets to decide what these characters do in any follow-ups to Black Adam. So he was literally trying to center this entire thing around himself. He was treating DC like his own personal vanity project. He had no interest in actually doing what Black Adam is supposed to do, which is fight Shazam. He was too busy and trying to set up a big, cool, badass brawl between him and Henry Cavill's Superman. And as soon as he saw that his grip on DC and that his power and leverage were about to disappear because James Gunn, the new sheriff, was coming in to take over, he thought he could go over James's head, bring in Henry Cavill, announce all these plans, force this issue, and make these next movies happen for himself, where he could now become a multi-billionaire producer on all these DC movies coming. Because I think part of the plan also was that since he was bringing Henry back, since it was through this storyline that we were going to be getting the return of Superman, I think he was also going to try to have his $7 production company also co-produce Man of Steel 2. So every step of the way, he was going to be making some money off of the Superman name, and he was trying to use Henry to do it. But what happens when your movie only opens to $67 million, Dwayne? All those plans go up in flames, and all those all those plans disappear. And essentially, that is exactly what happened to all of his very ego-driven plans for the DC universe. And the whole thing really just rubs me the wrong way, because Pamela Abdy and Mike DeLuca and Dwayne Johnson himself, they knew what was coming. They knew that the writing was on the wall, that there was going to be a new boss, and that DC in general was going to need this massive revamp. And yet they were just all too happy to try and force the hand of whoever David Zaslav hired. They were all too happy to maintain this broken status quo, with Warner Brothers Pictures still basically getting to decide what happens with DC, and where we're just going to continue to pump millions of dollars into a franchise that the public has long ago kind of said we are lukewarm about at best. Like, they knew that this thing, in order to succeed, was going to need major changes. And they knew that Zaslav was going to bring in someone who was going to create those major changes. But out of their own greed, out of their own desire for self-preservation, they made this desperate power play. And it's Henry who really suffered. Because as far as I know, Abdi and DeLuca still have their jobs over at Warner Brothers Pictures. And The Rock is still The Rock, making movies, and still one of the most recognizable faces in all of Hollywood and in all of popular culture, really. But the person who really suffered here was Henry. Because Henry knew he didn't have a deal. But he was told to go out there and start talking about his return. He was assured that if you go out there and start making all this noise, there's no way that the new DC boss is going to let you go. This is how we grab them by the cojones. This is how we make sure that your return as Superman is set. Go out there and start acting like this is all legit already. Even though it's interesting to point out that in an Entertainment Weekly interview published a couple of days after James Gunn's announcement, Henry was much more cautious than how he would be on the Josh Horowitz podcast. In that interview, he said something about how I can't really make any announcements about what might or might not happen. I can't really address anything in an official capacity, but we shall see. Which is really where things were. They were in a we shall see kind of place. Because that's the other interesting subplot in all of this. The Rock's crazy power play and Henry Cavill's return might have worked out if Black Adam had crushed it. If Black Adam had overperformed at the box office and become this instant runaway success, there's no way James Gunn would have canceled it. There's no way he could have realistically said, all right, everyone, never mind the Black Adam plans that you are all so hyped for, but that didn't happen. He couldn't do that because $67 million for a movie that costs like $260 million to make, that ain't going to cut it. So he put all his eggs into trying to make this thing work. And meanwhile, it was just like a generic paint by numbers action movie. That's what pisses me off also. It's like, if you're going to go and try to make this crazy power play and try to force these plans down our throat, then you better be making like the greatest movies possible. These movies better be so loaded with effort and care and an attention to detail that we're going to go, oh no, we have to see this vision through. But Black Adam had none of that. Black Adam was literally just like a Frankenstein's monster of cool superhero moments that have been popular these last 10 years with The Rock in the middle of it. That's all it really was. It was really nothing special of a movie. So for that to be the big shot that you shot in front of the world, and to be that you putting your best foot forward, so to speak, it's just ridiculous. If you were going to do this, you needed to make sure that you were going to create the greatest DC films that had ever happened. And that wasn't happening. And that didn't happen. And that wasn't the promise of Black Adam. But poor Henry Cavill was told to go out there and tell people, I'm back. And there's going to be a whole new era of hope and optimism and joy for Superman. And finally, I get to do the things that I've been wanting to do for years, and yada, yada, yada. And ultimately, he had to come out and say, never mind. I'm not coming back after all. They told me to tell you, but never mind. You know, it's just such a ridiculous situation. And it's honestly like it perfectly illustrates what James Gunn has said about how the way things at DC were for years were crap. It was terrible. It was effed up. You know, the way that he said that they would throw IP at anyone who just smiled at them nice. You know, there was nobody cohesively and coherently deciding what can and what can't happen in the DC universe. It was just a bunch of bizarre little stops and starts, and anyone who showed up and said, I'd like to do this with DC, could do it. He encountered that himself when he was there working on the Suicide Squad, and he found that there was almost anything he could get past the studio. That really there wasn't that main guy, that Kevin Feige type who would go, wait a minute, you can't use that character because we're using him 3 movies from now. Or you can't say that this character does that because that contradicts that. Like he saw, wait a minute, there's no boss here. There's nobody in charge making sure that this stuff is going to be okay. You know, and that really, you know, this situation with Henry perfectly exemplifies why we needed DC Studios and why we needed to separate ourselves from Warner Brothers Pictures. Because now James Gunn doesn't have to worry about Abdi and DeLuca. Now James Gunn doesn't have to worry about anything having to do with the film division at WBD. Because DC Studios is now separate of that. They only answer to David Zaslav. They only answer to the guy at the very top. And the guy at the very top has a very busy schedule because WBD is not just a film studio. Warner Brothers Discovery, they own all kinds of things. It is a massive corporate conglomerate. They've also got AT&T in there. They're also a phone company. They're also an internet company. They're all kinds of other things. The film stuff is just one little part of it. And now DC is separate of that, and it is its own IP under the WBD banner. So this thing may have sucked, and The Rock may have tried and failed abysmally in making all of DC about himself, but at least this final little explosion of ineptitude and ego was the final nail in the coffin of the DC entertainment era, of the DC as a subdivision of an indecisive and reactive and ridiculous film studio. That is all gone now. And honestly, I wonder if this debacle with Black Adam and Henry Cavill was the final push that gave James Gunn the leverage to tell Warner Brothers and David Zaslav, listen, this thing is a mess. The people you have running Warner Brothers just almost screwed this thing up again, and for good, and for much longer. Because if their plans had worked, we'd be getting these generic, crappy action DC movies for the next couple of years, and it would just be the continuing law of diminishing returns. We saw how people felt about the 4 DC movies that came out after Black Adam. So we've been rescued from that crappy future. We now have a DC Studios in charge of everything. But we have a Henry Cavill who was jerked around by the previous administration and who was used as a bargaining ploy for Dwayne Johnson, who just wanted his piece of the DC pie, who wanted to use DC to elevate his profile, become a mega hyphenate producer, and make himself the center of the DC universe. So It was a crappy period in our time that has now come to a close, but Dwayne Johnson's power play at DC was the final nail in the coffin of a very sad history of DC at Warner Brothers. And hopefully Henry can rebound. You know, the recent news is that the project that he was going to be working on next, an adaptation of the Warhammer video game series, is also now in limbo. They haven't been able to get a deal in place to get Warhammer made either. And he's already stepped away from The Witcher. So poor Henry Cavill has not been having the best run of it these last few years. And if you think about it, he hasn't really gotten to play Superman in all of his glory on the biggest stage ever for over 10 years. So his run as Superman really did end much longer ago than any of us want to admit or realize. But the final question I just want to, answer here is, was Henry fired? Because that's the big thing. That's why some people are still upset with DC Studios and people are still mad at James Gunn. But to be clear, he was not fired. He was never hired to be part of this Superman reboot. This Superman reboot that we're getting, that just wrapped this week, this Superman reboot was put into effect during a time where Henry Cavill was already gone. He was not returning. That's why we were going to start from scratch with a brand new Superman. So with that in mind, he was never hired for James Gunn's Superman, and he never signed a deal for a Man of Steel 2 or any new movies coming out of Black Adam. All he did was accept a nice fee per appearance, per cameo in a couple of upcoming DC movies with the hopes that there would be excitement for some renewed, continued second round of Henry Cavill as Superman movies. But no. Henry was not fired. Henry was never going to be part of the DCU. He was only going to be part of these Black Adam plans that after the film bombed weren't going to happen anyway. And right now, to conclude all this, I'm going to give the final gavel on this situation to James Gunn himself, because he weighed in on what happened with Henry. And here's what he said at the very early part of 2023 in an interview with The Wrap. He said, "I like Henry. He's a great guy. I think he's gotten bleeped around by a lot of people, including former regimes at this company. But this Superman's not Henry for a number of reasons." But you hear that? Gunn himself. I think he's gotten bleeped around by a lot of people, including former regimes at this company. We know exactly who he's talking about now, don't we? And with that, that concludes episode 4 of the Superman on Film podcast. Thank you for checking out the show. Be sure to like, rate, review, subscribe on your podcatcher of choice. Subscribe over on the YouTube. Leave me your comments and words of encouragement, and I'll be happy to read them on the air. I want to read your reviews. Let's keep the love going, because this is the new, fastest rising, most popular Superman podcast around right now. Thank you for everyone who's shown such an amazing amount of support so far that has me trending on Apple Podcasts. The very first thing you see when you search for Superman in a sea of Superman podcasts, number 1 is this one right here, and that is entirely because of you. So thanks for your support. Hopefully you enjoyed this show. Let's keep it going. And until next week, life is chaos. Be kind. Up, up and away.